Knowledge was once a river flowing through narrow channels, guided by a small number of gatekeepers. In the medieval era, scribes held the keys to what information survived, what was carefully copied, and ultimately, what ideas shaped the civilization we inherited. You will learn about the quiet mechanisms that allowed these individuals to build the intellectual world we know today. What did they choose to leave out of the historical record? And how could a simple spelling variation influence the direction of a spiritual tradition? How does their thoughtful selection of texts reflect the systems that organize our digital experiences now? By the end, you will understand the profound influence held by the hand that writes, and you may never look at a book in quite the same way. What does it mean for all of us when so few help decide what everyone else comes to understand? To understand the power of the scribe, you must first grasp the world of the scroll. Picture a long, unwieldy roll of parchment, a format that demanded your full attention. Reading was not a casual flick through pages. It was a deliberate, two-handed performance. You unrolled with one hand while carefully rolling with the other, your eyes traveling down a single, unbroken column of text. This physical experience enforced a strict, linear journey through the information. There was no simple way to jump back to a previous chapter or skip ahead to the conclusion. The scroll itself dictated the pace and the path of your learning, locking knowledge into a single, authoritative sequence. This made the great libraries of the ancient world, like the legendary Library of Alexandria, both temples of knowledge and fortresses of it. You could not borrow a scroll to take home. To access its wisdom, you had to be physically present, a privilege reserved for a select few scholars and elites who had the means to travel and the permission to enter. The scroll naturally favored certain kinds of stories, grand epics and linear histories that flowed seamlessly from beginning to end. But this very rigidity, this physical control over how information was consumed, was about to be shattered by a simple, revolutionary invention. Then came a quiet revolution, a new vessel for thought that would change everything. It was the Codex, the ancestor of the modern book, and its design was brilliantly simple. Instead of one long, continuous roll, it used separate sheets of parchment, folded and bound together at the spine. This was a technological leap as profound as the printing press would be centuries later. Suddenly, information was no longer a river you had to navigate from start to finish. With a codex, you could open it to any page. You could jump from the beginning to the end and back again. This was the birth of random access. You could now create an index, a map to the knowledge within, allowing a reader to find a specific passage in moments rather than spending hours unrolling a scroll. This new format was also far more portable and durable. A single bound volume could hold the contents of many scrolls, protecting the text between sturdy covers. It was a library you could hold in your hands. Early Christian communities were among the first to widely embrace this new technology for their scriptures. This practical choice carried a powerful symbolic weight, helping to distinguish their new faith from the traditional Jewish scrolls used in synagogues. The Codex facilitated the spread of their texts, making it easier for missionaries to carry and share the Gospels across vast distances. It subtly democratized knowledge by making it easier to compile diverse writings, from the teachings of Jesus to letters from apostles and early church laws, into a single, cohesive volume. This new vessel for thought, however, was empty. It required a new kind of craftsman to fill its blank pages with meaning, setting the stage for the true master of the written word to step into the spotlight. Within the monastery walls, the Scriptorium hummed with a quiet, focused energy. This was the knowledge workshop of the Middle Ages, a place where the written word was not merely stored but carefully crafted by hand. Imagine a long stone room, often unheated, where the main source of light was a high window, its beam falling upon rows of wooden desks known as carrels. Here, monks spent their days in disciplined silence, their only sounds the soft scratch of a quill and the occasional turning of a parchment page. This silence was a practical necessity, a guard against the costly errors that could creep into a text from a moment of distraction. But it was also a spiritual act. Each carefully formed letter was considered a form of prayer, a physical offering to divine understanding. The very architecture served this singular purpose, the carrels arranged like stations on an assembly line, all oriented to capture every possible minute of daylight for the sacred task of replication. This was a production line with a profound mission. The work was slow, arduous, and deeply controlled. An abbot or a senior scribe held the ultimate authority, deciding which texts were worthy of the immense labor required to copy them. This was the first crucial layer of filtering knowledge. A classical work of philosophy, a medical treatise, or a liturgical text, each had to pass through this gatekeeper's judgment before it could be granted a new life on the page. The scribe at his desk was not an author but a conduit. His duty was fidelity, to reproduce the text before him with as few deviations as possible. Yet, in this human process, subtle changes were inevitable. A tired monk might mishear a word during dictation. A difficult passage might be unconsciously simplified. A marginal note, a tiny sketch in the corner, these small, personal touches became part of the text's new identity, a quiet whisper from the copyist that would travel through time. The products of this quiet workshop then began their own journeys. Once a volume was complete, it might be lent to another monastery for copying, or become a cherished addition to the house's own library. In this way, the Scriptorium's curated vision of the world, its specific selection of religious and classical knowledge, was packaged and shared. Each book that left its walls was not a neutral object. It was a vessel carrying a specific set of ideas, approved by a hierarchy and shaped by the silent, devoted hands of its creators. This system of careful replication ensured that certain voices from the past would echo into the future, while others, deemed less important or perhaps even challenging, simply faded away, their absence as telling as the presence of the texts that survived. The scribe's workbench held more than simple stationery. It was a carefully arranged collection of specialized instruments, each with a distinct role in the slow conversion of a raw animal skin into a sacred page. The foundation of this entire process was the parchment itself, a material that embodied immense value and labor long before the first word was written. Creating it began with the skin of a sheep, goat, or calf known as vellum. This material underwent a lengthy transformation, being soaked in lime, then meticulously scraped and prepared before being stretched taut on a frame to dry. The surface was finally polished with pumice stone until it was smooth and uniform, a blank canvas ready to carry thought for centuries. This was not merely paper. It was a durable, precious resource, and every cut of the sheet was calculated to minimize waste, making the scribe's margin for error frustratingly literal. His primary instrument was the quill, far superior to a reed pen for the delicate work of formal bookends. A feather from a goose or swan was cured with gentle heat to harden it, then its tip was cut with a precise slit and point. This simple, sharpened nib was the engine of textual variation. With varying pressure, the scribe could produce the characteristic thick downstrokes and hair-thin upstrokes that defined scripts like the clear and elegant Carolingian Minuscule, a style that promoted remarkable readability across the continent. But the quill was useless without its partner, the ink. Ink making was its own form of alchemy. The most common black ink was iron gall ink, a potent mixture born from oak galls, the unusual growths formed on trees by wasp larvae. These galls were crushed and mixed with iron sulfate, creating a chemical reaction that produced a deep, lasting black pigment when it touched the parchment. Gum arabic, a sap from the acacia tree, was added as a binder, ensuring the ink adhered to the page without flaking away. For the brilliant colors that lit up the margins and initial letters, the scribe or a specialized illuminator turned to a palette of ground minerals and precious substances. Vivid blue came from lapis lazuli, a stone imported from distant Afghanistan. A striking red was made from vermilion, a mercury-based compound. These were the most expensive elements on the desk, their use reserved for texts of the highest importance, visually signaling the value of the words they adorned. This intricate toolkit reveals a profound truth. Writing was not an abstract mental exercise. It was a physical, chemical, and deeply artistic process. The quality of the quill's cut affected the clarity of the text. The purity of the ink determined its resistance to fading. The preparation of the parchment ensured the longevity of the entire work. Every choice, from the selection of a feather to the grinding of a precious stone, was a direct investment in the authority and endurance of the knowledge being recorded. Yet, even with these perfect tools, the human element remained the most unpredictable of all. A single bound manuscript could hold a value that is almost incomprehensible today. We are not talking about the price of a modern luxury car, but an asset comparable to a small farm or a full suit of armor for a knight. This staggering worth was built from the ground up, starting with the very materials it was created from. To produce one complete Bible required the prepared hides of more than 200 animals. Each sheet of parchment represented a significant investment of livestock, labor, and land. Then came the scribe's time, a precious resource measured in years. A major liturgical work could occupy a single monk for an entire year or more, his every waking moment dedicated to the careful formation of letters. This was not merely a project, it was a lifetime's portion of work bound between two covers. Such immense cost created a simple, powerful truth: the patron held the ultimate pen. Whether a wealthy noble, a powerful bishop, or a king seeking to affirm his rule, these were the individuals who commissioned the creation of books. Their personal interests, their political ambitions, and their religious convictions became the primary filters through which knowledge passed. A noble might fund a lavishly illuminated epic that honored his family lineage. A bishop would naturally prioritize copies of theological works that supported the teachings of his diocese. The scribe, for all his skill, was an instrument of this system. His hand reproduced the worldviews of his benefactors, ensuring that their preferred version of history, faith, and law would be the one preserved for the future. This relationship transformed knowledge into a clear luxury good. A monastery's scriptorium did not only produce books for its own library, it also functioned as a specialized workshop for hire. Creating a commissioned text for an outside patron provided a crucial source of income, funding the monastery's operations and further solidifying its place in the economic and intellectual network of the era. Every time a scribe dipped his quill, he was participating in a market. He was copying a product that had been pre-approved by a paying customer. This economic reality wove a subtle but unbreakable thread connecting wealth, power, and information. The voices that were amplified were, with very few exceptions, the ones that someone with substantial resources had already decided were worth hearing. This system of curated reproduction ensured that the intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages was not a random collection of surviving texts, but a carefully tended garden, cultivated by the hands of scribes and shaped by the resources of the influential. The choices made in these transactions did more than fill libraries. They quietly built the foundations of entire systems of belief, creating traditions that would guide societies for centuries. The silent hand of the scribe held a power far greater than simple transcription. His most profound control was exercised not in the way he formed his letters, but in the very words he allowed to cross the threshold from an old manuscript onto a fresh sheet of parchment. Every time a scribe prepared to copy a text, he stood as a gatekeeper, making a conscious choice about what knowledge was valuable enough to be granted a future. Consider a classical work of philosophy arriving at a monastic scriptorium, its pages filled with ideas about the natural world written by thinkers who lived long before the rise of the church. Passages that spoke of a universe without a single divine creator, or that proposed scientific theories at odds with biblical teachings, presented a quiet dilemma. The response was not always a dramatic act of suppression. More often, it was a subtle, almost invisible process of curation. A challenging passage might be gently rephrased to align with orthodox belief. A complex argument about astronomy might be left out because the abbot deemed it irrelevant to the spiritual mission of the community. Sometimes the omission was not even intentional, but a result of practical constraints. The only available source manuscript might have been damaged, its final pages lost to moisture or wear, leaving the scribe with an incomplete story that he could not reconstruct. In other cases, a scribe working in a cold scriptorium, his focus trained on theological texts, might simply have had no personal interest in preserving a dense treatise on mathematics. He would copy what he understood and valued, and the rest would quietly fade from the record. The collective weight of these individual decisions, made in isolated scriptoria over hundreds of years, acted like a great filter for the river of classical knowledge. This is why many of the works of the Greek philosopher Aristotle were lost to Western Europe for centuries, while they were actively preserved and studied in the Islamic world. The intellectual landscape of the medieval West was not an accident. It was a curated collection, a library built by countless small, daily judgments about what was true, what was useful, and what was safe to remember. This quiet process of selection determined the very raw materials from which the Renaissance would eventually be constructed, a powerful reminder that what is left behind can shape a civilization as deeply as what is saved. A translator's quill did not simply copy words, it rebuilt entire worlds of thought. When a text crossed from Greek into Arabic, or from Arabic into Latin, it passed through the mind of an interpreter who held immense power. This was not a simple mechanical task like pouring water from one jar into another. It was a creative, often deeply personal act of bridge building. The translator had to find equivalent words in a new language for concepts that sometimes had no direct parallel. A single choice, the selection of one term over another, could subtly bend a philosophical idea or redirect the understanding of a scientific principle for generations. The translator's own education, his cultural assumptions, and the intellectual priorities of his time were woven directly into the fabric of the translated work. In the vibrant, multicultural city of Toledo, a scholar named Gerard of Cremona became one of these pivotal figures. He dedicated his life to translating dozens of Arabic scientific works into Latin, the scholarly language of Western Europe. Through his efforts, European thinkers gained access to the astronomical works of Ptolemy, the medical wisdom of Galen, and the vast philosophical library of Aristotle, much of which had been preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. Gerard was not a neutral channel. With every sentence he rendered into Latin, he made decisions that would shape how European universities understood physics, medicine, and the very nature of the cosmos for centuries. He effectively decided which version of Aristotle would travel north and how his ideas would be framed. The process was deeply interpretive. Translators like Gerard often added their own commentaries and explanations directly into the text, guiding the reader's understanding. A difficult passage in the original might be followed by a clarifying note from the translator, blending the ancient voice with a medieval one. This meant a student in Paris reading a Latin copy of an Arabic commentary on a Greek text was experiencing a layered conversation across time and cultures, all filtered through the final translator's lens. The language a text was written in acted as a powerful gate. A work in Arabic remained within the Islamic world's sphere of learning. Once translated into Latin, it entered the bloodstream of European academia. Translators like Gerard of Cremona stood at these crossroads, controlling the traffic of ideas between civilizations. They were the quiet architects of the intellectual maps that scholars would use to navigate reality, proving that the meaning of knowledge is often shaped by the hands that carry it across a border. Even the most disciplined scribe was only human, and his work was a constant balancing act with his own fallibility. A moment of distraction, a tired hand, or a misheard word during group dictation could introduce a tiny crack in the foundation of a text. These were not mere imperfections, they were historical footprints marking the path a manuscript traveled across generations. A skipped line, a repeated phrase, or a simple misspelling became part of the text's DNA, copied faithfully by the next scribe who trusted the page before him. This created a genealogical tree of variations, a trail of clues that modern scholars follow to trace a manuscript's lineage back to its source. The most dramatic proof of a small change's power came centuries later with the so-called Wicked Bible. In a 17th century printed edition, a typesetter's simple omission transformed the seventh commandment into a surprising instruction. The verse read, "Thou shalt commit adultery." This single oversight was considered so significant that the entire print run was ordered to be recalled by the authorities, a costly testament to how a small human slip could carry monumental consequences. Within the Scriptorium, a system of careful review was always at work, a quiet effort toward accuracy waged with a handful of simple tools. The primary instrument for correction was the knife. A scribe who noticed a mistake while the ink was still fresh would carefully smooth the parchment surface, clearing the flawed letters to prepare for a new attempt. This left a slightly different texture, a subtle reminder of the original variation. For mistakes discovered later, a different method was used. The correct text would be written in the margin, often with a series of delicate symbols pointing to the exact location in the main column. These marginal notes, known as glosses, sometimes grew into extensive commentaries, with later readers adding their own thoughts and interpretations beside the original text. This layered conversation happening in the white space around the official words reveals that a manuscript was never a static monument. It was a living document, constantly being reviewed, debated, and refined. The very presence of these corrections tells us that the scribes were not mindless copyists. They were engaged readers, actively trying to produce a clean and accurate copy, even as their own humanity inevitably introduced new character. Their variations and their corrections together form an unintentional diary of the transmission process, a record of the daily endeavor to keep knowledge intact as it passed from one hand and one generation to the next. The monastic walls did more than shelter scribes. They defined the very boundaries of acceptable thought. For nearly 1,000 years, the most organized and consistent system for reproducing knowledge was the vast network of monasteries stretching across Europe. Within this world, a scribe was not merely a craftsman, he was a monk whose central purpose was spiritual. His daily labor in the Scriptorium was an act of devotion, a form of prayer performed with his hands. This religious mission created a powerful, built-in filter for all information. The highest priority was always given to sacred texts, the pages of the Bible, the liturgy for Mass, and the commentaries written by early church fathers. Copying these works ensured the stability and orthodoxy of Christian doctrine, creating a unified spiritual foundation for a fragmented continent. But this intense focus came with a consequence. A classical text on Roman engineering or a pagan poet's epic was simply not part of this core mission. Such secular works survived only by chance or through a very specific kind of usefulness. A philosophical dialogue might be copied if it could be interpreted as a lesson in moral living. A text on logic or grammar might be preserved because it provided the mental tools needed to better understand Scripture itself. This was not a malicious destruction of knowledge, but a quiet, consistent prioritization. The system itself was institutionalized by the rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational guide for monastic life that prescribed a balance of prayer, manual labor, and sacred reading. The work of copying texts was formally recognized as a form of holy labor. This transformed the Scriptorium from a simple workshop into a place of spiritual duty, where every stroke of the pen served a higher purpose. The collective output of these countless monastic cells over centuries was a curated library of the Western world. The knowledge that was actively and repeatedly copied, the voices that were amplified again and again, were overwhelmingly theological. This created an intellectual environment where the primary questions, the main debates, and the accepted answers all revolved around a religious axis. The monastic gatekeepers, through their daily, devout work, directly shaped the landscape of European thought, ensuring that for generations, the river of knowledge flowed primarily through channels they had carefully dug and maintained. A new kind of scribe began to appear in the bustling lanes of university towns and the halls of royal courts, his allegiance pledged not to a monastery but to his guild and his paying customers. This was the secular professional, a trained writer for hire whose work reflected the shifting priorities of a changing world. Where the monastic scribe's primary concern was the salvation of souls, the secular scribe's focus was on the practical needs of a burgeoning society. University students created a roaring demand for affordable copies of textbooks on logic, medicine, and law. Lawyers needed accurate legal codes and charters. Merchants required detailed ledgers to track their complex transactions across continents. Knowledge was breaking free from its purely religious vessel, spilling out into the secular marketplace of ideas. This commercial shift introduced a completely new filter for controlling the flow of information, economic viability. A text's survival was no longer guaranteed by its theological importance alone. Its future now depended on its popularity, its utility, and its ability to find a paying audience. A manual on Arabic mathematics could be copied dozens of times because it offered merchants better tools for accounting. A collection of lyrical poetry might be commissioned by a noble patron seeking to display his refined taste. The secular scribe, operating as a small business, naturally responded to these market signals. He would copy what sold, what was requested, and what kept his workshop profitable. This was a profound decentralization of power. No single abbot or bishop could now dictate the entirety of what was being preserved. The intellectual landscape began to diversify at a remarkable pace. Texts on secular law, practical medicine, and even entertainment began to circulate with a new freedom, creating a richer, more complex tapestry of thought. Yet, this new system of economic control was just as powerful as the old religious one. It meant that a brilliant but obscure philosophical treatise, with no obvious practical application or wealthy patron, still risked fading from view. The gatekeepers had changed, but the gates remained. Now, however, they were opened not only by prayer, but also by the clinking of coins in a merchant's purse. a quiet economic force that would forever alter the course of what we remember. The third and most powerful form of control was not held by the scribe, but by the person who paid for his ink. The hand that paid the piper truly called the tune, and in the medieval world, that hand belonged to the patron. A king seeking to legitimize his rule would commission a lavish chronicle, its pages filled with heroic illustrations of his battles and a lineage tracing his ancestry back to legendary founders. A bishop aiming to consolidate his spiritual authority would order dozens of copies of canon law, ensuring every church in his diocese followed the same rules he endorsed. This relationship went far beyond a simple transaction. The patron's personal tastes and political needs dictated every detail. He decided whether the manuscript would be a simple, functional text or a breathtaking work of art illuminated with gold leaf and precious pigments. He specified the quality of the parchment, the elegance of the script, and even which version of a historical event or theological argument would be copied. By funding the creation of a book, a patron was directly paying for a specific vision of reality to be crafted and preserved. This system naturally amplified the voices of the powerful while leaving others in historical silence. The daily lives, folk wisdom, and spiritual beliefs of peasants were almost never deemed worthy of such a costly investment. The perspectives of women, unless they were queens or influential abbesses, were rarely recorded for posterity. The magnificent illuminated manuscripts we now admire in museum cases are not neutral windows into the past. They are beautiful, deliberate monuments built from parchment and ink to the ambitions and worldviews of the wealthy few who could afford to create them. The very shape of a letter could carry the weight of an empire. When Charlemagne sought to unify his vast and diverse territories, he understood that political control required intellectual cohesion. His solution was not just a new law or a military campaign, but a revolution in handwriting. He commissioned the scholar Alcuin of York to develop a new, clear, and uniform script, which we now know as Carolingian Minuscule. Imagine the difference this made. Before this reform, a monk in France might struggle to read a manuscript copied in Italy, not because of the language, but because the local script was a tangled forest of unique letter forms. Charlemagne's new script was a master key. Its rounded, separated letters, consistent spacing, and clever use of both upper and lower case created a visual clarity that was unprecedented. This was not merely an aesthetic improvement. It was a deliberate tool for guiding the flow of knowledge by making it more accurate and universally accessible within his cultural sphere. For the first time, a text copied in a scriptorium in Aachen could be read with perfect ease by a scholar in Rome, ensuring that the same version of a liturgy, law, or chronicle was being shared across the continent. This standardization was a form of intellectual infrastructure as vital as any road, binding the empire together with threads of ink. Yet, as the Middle Ages progressed, the priorities shifted from clarity to economy. The soaring cost of parchment and the rising demand for books in university towns led to the development of the dense, compressed Gothic scripts. These letter forms were designed to save space, packing more words onto each precious page. The result was a text that was efficient and cost-effective, but also far more challenging to read. The letters were narrow, crowded, and heavily abbreviated, their uniformity creating a wall of text that demanded a trained eye to decipher. This subtle change acted as a new filter. A casual reader or someone with only basic literacy would find such a page intimidating and inaccessible. The script itself now restricted readership to a specialized class of clerics, lawyers, and university-trained scholars. The choice of handwriting was never a neutral decision about style. It was a direct reflection of political ambition, economic pressure, and the intended audience. a royal decree would be penned in a stately, clear hand to convey authority and ensure comprehension. A personal prayer book for a noblewoman might use a more flowing, decorative script. A university textbook, driven by the need for affordability, would often resort to the dense, abbreviated Gothic. Each script, from the open clarity of the Carolingian to the closed complexity of the Gothic, served as a subtle gatekeeper, quietly controlling who could step inside the world of the written word and participate in the conversation of the age. A blank margin was never truly empty space. It was a territory open for exploration, where the silent dialogue between a text and its readers was permanently recorded. Scribes and scholars did not simply reproduce the words in the center of the page. They surrounded them with a protective and guiding layer of commentary known as glosses. Written in a smaller, more hurried script between the lines or crowding the edges, these notes acted as a gentle guide, steering every future reader toward a specific understanding. A difficult word from an ancient Greek text would get a simple Latin translation written directly above it. A complex philosophical argument would be summarized neatly in the margin. More powerfully, a passage with potential for unorthodox interpretation would be framed by commentary that reinforced the accepted and doctrinally safe reading. The primary text was no longer speaking for itself. It was now presented with its official interpreter permanently attached. In the bustling intellectual world of the medieval university, this practice became a primary method of teaching and shaping thought. Take Peter Lombard's Sentences, a comprehensive compilation of theological opinions that became the standard textbook for centuries. The text itself was central, but its meaning was truly defined by the accumulated glosses that generations of masters had written around it. A student did not just read Lombard's words, he read them through the lens of these authoritative commentaries, which pointed out contradictions, highlighted key passages, and ultimately shaped the boundaries of acceptable debate. The commentary became as vital as the original, a guide that decided which interpretations were valid and which were considered outside the lines. This framing mechanism was the key to handling classical works with challenging ideas. A pagan philosopher's thoughts about the soul could be copied and preserved, but only after being thoughtfully placed within the margins by a Christian scholar's explanations. The challenging ideas were thus transformed, becoming curious artifacts that illustrated the richness of the prevailing worldview. Every time a reader's eyes moved from the central text to the gloss, they were being quietly shown how to think. The page itself became a map, with the main text as the landmark and the glosses as the approved paths for navigating its meaning. The page was a stage, and the illuminator was its director. While the scribe crafted the script, this specialized artist painted the scenery and cast the characters, using a visual language that could bypass the intellect and speak directly to the heart. Their work was far more than decoration. It was a form of persuasion, a way to shape not just what a reader understood, but how they felt about the information before them. A ruler seeking to affirm his authority would commission a magnificent illumination showing him kneeling, receiving his crown directly from the hand of God. This single image, placed within a prayer book or a chronicle, carried a message more potent than any written decree. It embedded a political claim into a sacred context, making divine approval seem like a visible, established fact. The power of the ruler was no longer a matter of debate. It was a truth illustrated in brilliant color and gleaming gold. Beyond these grand central images, the margins of the manuscript teemed with a secret life of their own. These border drawings, known as marginalia, could serve many masters. A delicate vine might curl around the text, ending in a flower that held a tiny portrait of a saint, offering a focal point for quiet devotion. But just as often, these margins became a space for satire and subtle commentary. A rabbit dressed as a knight might be seen jousting a snail. A monk with an exaggerated expression could be depicted playing a fiddle. These playful, sometimes whimsical, figures created a complex and often humorous dialogue with the solemn words they surrounded. They could gently reflect on human nature, provide a moment of levity, or even offer a quiet observation on the very authority the main text proclaimed. This visual richness meant that reading a medieval manuscript was never a passive experience. The reader's eye was constantly pulled between the official narrative and the unofficial, often surprising, world in the margins. The materials themselves were part of the message. The application of gold leaf, meticulously hammered into delicate sheets and carefully laid upon the page, was an act of profound significance. This was not merely a display of wealth, though it certainly was that. The reflective, luminous quality of gold was understood to represent the divine light of heaven itself. To see a page shimmer in the candlelight was to witness a physical piece of the celestial realm. Similarly, the most vibrant blues and reds came from pigments like lapis lazuli and vermilion, substances so costly they were often accounted for like treasure. Their use signaled that the words they adorned were not ordinary. They were truths of ultimate importance, worthy of the most precious materials on earth. This visual splendor commanded awe and reinforced reverence, guiding the reader to approach the text with a specific, humbled attitude. In this way, the illuminator was a true co-author of meaning. Their brushstrokes decided which biblical scenes would be remembered most vividly, which kings would be honored as pious, and which ideas would be associated with beauty and sanctity. They used a universal language of color, symbol, and composition to frame the written word, ensuring that the reader absorbed not only the information but also a specific, carefully crafted emotional and cultural response. The manuscript was a complete sensory experience, and the illuminator made certain that every element of that experience served to reinforce the intended message. A scribe with his writing case slung over his shoulder was a walking conduit for ideas. These itinerant professionals, unbound by monastery walls, moved along the pilgrim routes and trade roads that crisscrossed medieval Europe. Their workplace was wherever a client had need, from a bustling university town where students clamored for textbooks, to a merchant's guild hall requiring contracts, to a local lord's estate in need of a formal charter. This constant travel transformed them into vital agents of cultural exchange. A scribe who had trained in the Italian peninsula might introduce a new, elegant script style to a scriptorium in France. Another, carrying a bundle of parchments from a German university, could bring a previously unknown legal commentary to England. They were the human internet of their age, their satchels packed with the latest intellectual trends and practical innovations, physically linking distant centers of learning and power. Their work was the bedrock of a growing secular society. While monks meticulously copied psalters, the itinerant scribe was more likely to be found drafting a land deed, composing a merchant's business letter, or recording the minutes of a town council meeting. These were not texts for eternal salvation, but documents for daily life, governance, and commerce. This practical focus meant their output was immediately responsive to the needs of the world outside the cloister. If a new method of accounting spread among merchants, the itinerant scribe would be the first to learn it and apply it. If a dispute over property rights required a written precedent, he was the one to hunt it down and produce a certified copy. This very pragmatism gave him a unique form of independence. He was not bound by the singular doctrinal filter of an abbot or the specific political agenda of a single royal court. His fidelity was to his craft and to the diverse clients who paid for his services. This mobility introduced a new dynamic into the control of knowledge. An idea that might be overlooked in one region could find a willing scribe to copy and transport it to another, more receptive locale. The itinerant scribe operated in a decentralized network, a system far less monolithic than the organized scriptorium. He carried with him not only texts, but also the very means of their production, his own skilled hands. On the eve of the printing press, these wandering figures represented a more fluid and adaptable model of information sharing, one that was already beginning to subtly challenge the older, more rigid channels of control. They proved that knowledge could not be entirely contained within stone walls, that it had a tendency to slip into a travel bag and find its way to new minds. The chained book was a powerful symbol of knowledge under careful stewardship. Step into a medieval library, and you would find volumes physically connected to their reading desks by long, sturdy chains. This was not an act of restriction, but a necessary safeguard for objects of immense value. Each chain was attached to a metal rod fitted through the binding of the book, allowing it to be lifted and read at the desk but never carried away. This system, known as a chaining library, created a space where wisdom was available for consultation but thoughtfully contained. The library was a fortress for ideas, and the chains were its most visible protectors. They ensured that the scribe's painstakingly crafted work, representing years of labor and a fortune in materials, remained exactly where the community needed it to be. Access to this inner sanctum was a privilege, not a right. The doors were typically open only to monks within a monastery, canons of a cathedral, or the masters and students of a university. This created a clear intellectual structure, a group defined by their physical closeness to these curated collections. The common person, the merchant, the artisan, even the lower-ranking cleric, would almost never set foot inside. Their understanding of the world was shaped by sermons and oral tradition, while the chained books held the authoritative written word. Control extended beyond the bookshelves to the very index of what was available. The library catalog was a master list, a guide that directed a scholar's research along established paths. Organized by author or by subject, this catalog did not merely describe the collection. It defined the boundaries of accepted inquiry. A student seeking to understand medicine would find the texts the institution had chosen to acquire and secure. He would not find the texts it had rejected, lost, or simply never known about. His entire intellectual universe was mapped out by that single document. This physical and intellectual structure meant that the knowledge so carefully filtered by patrons, scribes, and translators found its lasting home in a thoughtfully maintained repository. The library was the final destination, the vault where the curated version of reality was stored, preserved, and presented as the complete picture. It was the ultimate expression of a system designed to ensure that the flow of information moved only through channels that the guardians of culture had built and approved. Behind the convent walls, another community of scribes was hard at work, their contributions often rendered invisible by history. Women in monastic orders, particularly in the great abbeys led by influential figures like Hildegard of Bingen, were not passive recipients of knowledge. They were active producers, running their own scriptoria to create the books essential for their spiritual lives. Their output was tailored to the needs of their female religious communities, producing beautifully illuminated psalters, volumes of visionary writings, and musical manuscripts for their liturgies. Within their own sphere, these women exercised complete creative and intellectual control, preserving and shaping a distinctively female perspective on faith and devotion. Yet their legacy is marked by a profound silence. Their work was frequently anonymous or, over time, attributed to the hands of male monks. Access to the broader world of learning was also carefully managed for them. While a monk might copy a classical text on astronomy or philosophy, A nun's work was often more tightly focused on devotional materials, her intellectual world subtly bounded by the priorities of the wider patriarchal society. This does not diminish their achievement. It reveals a parallel stream of knowledge production, one that flowed just beneath the surface of the dominant historical record. Recovering these hidden hands forces us to ask a difficult question. How many other voices shaping the flow of knowledge from the margins have we simply failed to see because they did not fit the traditional narrative of who held the pen? Every manuscript carries a second story, one told not in ink but in the very substance of its being. The quality of its parchment whispers its origin. A book made from fine, supple calfskin vellum, its surface nearly white and uniform, speaks of a wealthy patron and a scriptorium with access to the finest materials. In contrast, a volume crafted from thicker, more irregular sheepskin with visible hair follicles and subtle textural variations might reveal a more modest monastic house, making careful use of local resources. These material choices were the first layer of a book's identity, a silent declaration of its perceived importance and the economic power behind its creation. The binding, whether a simple leather cover stitched over wooden boards or a spectacular treasure binding adorned with ivory, jewels, and repoussé metalwork, broadcast the book's purpose to the world. A university textbook was often bound for pure utility, its sturdy but plain covers designed to withstand the constant handling of students. A gospel book destined for the altar, however, was bound for glory. Its ornate cover, shimmering with precious materials, transformed the text into a sacred object, a visual and tactile representation of the divine wisdom it contained. The binding was a public statement, controlling how the book was perceived and handled before a single page was even turned. Perhaps the most telling clues are found in the gentle wear accumulated over centuries. A manuscript with deeply softened edges on its calendar of saints' feast days reveals those pages were touched and referenced most often, guiding the daily rhythm of prayer. A section of canon law that is noticeably more worn than the surrounding theological commentaries points to a community actively engaged in legal or administrative matters. The physical softening is not damage, it is a preserved record of human attention, marking which ideas were most vital, most discussed, or most comforting to its long chain of readers. This wear pattern is a direct map to the intellectual and spiritual priorities of the people who used it. A pivotal shift in this material story arrived with the gradual adoption of paper. Unlike parchment, which was carefully prepared from animal skins, paper was made from pulped linen and cotton rags. This process was far less costly, dramatically reducing the economic barrier to book production. While the most prestigious texts continued to be copied on parchment for generations, the availability of paper meant that more people could commission copies, and scribes could produce them more quickly. This did not shatter the old systems of control overnight, but it did begin to create openings, allowing knowledge to reach new hands and new social circles. The book as a physical object, from its skin and binding to its softened corners, is a material witness. It tells us about cost and access, about daily use and devotional practice, offering a tangible history of how knowledge was valued, handled, and ultimately shaped by the very substance it was written on. A new technology arrived that promised to replicate a manuscript not just once, but 100 times over. The printing press with movable type did not erase the scribe overnight. Instead, it initiated a slow but unstoppable revolution, one that would ultimately transform his ancient role in sharing the written word. The earliest printed books, known today as incunabula, paid a quiet homage to the world they were replacing. Their layouts carefully mimicked the elegant columns of a manuscript page, and spaces were often left blank for skilled illustrators to add hand-painted initials and flourishes, just as they always had. The form was familiar, but the underlying mechanism was something entirely new. Where a scribe's hand could produce a single, precious copy in a year, the press could now create a uniform edition of hundreds in a matter of weeks. This single fact reshaped the old economics of knowledge. The cost of a book plummeted, and the speed of its dissemination exploded, creating a flood of texts that was suddenly much harder for any central authority to contain or guide. For a time, the scribes adapted. They leaned into their unique artistry, focusing on the creation of breathtaking luxury manuscripts for elite patrons who still viewed the printed book as a common, mass-produced object. Their hands found new work in finishing what the press had started, adding rich color to printed pages or crafting exquisite bindings, but this was a rearguard action. The fundamental role of the scribe was shifting from a primary producer to a specialized decorator. The true power was transferring from the solitary hand in the scriptorium to the printer's workshop, a bustling place filled with the clatter of type and the smell of ink. The gatekeeper was no longer the individual who copied the text, but the one who decided which text to print in the first place, and in how many thousands of copies. This technological shift marked the beginning of the end for one era of information control and the turbulent, exhilarating dawn of another, where the power to shape knowledge would soon be offered to a much wider public. The quiet hum of the scriptorium has found a new home in the silent, ceaseless calculations of an algorithm. The very mechanisms that early communities perfected for managing information, from gatekeeping to standardization, are the invisible architectures of our digital world. Today, vast networks of computer code act as our collective scribe, constantly copying, sorting, and presenting a curated version of reality to each of us. Where a medieval monk decided which classical text was worthy of parchment, a complex algorithm now decides which news story or social post is worthy of your attention, its choices based on opaque measures of engagement and profitability. This creates a deeply personalized information experience, a digital filter bubble as real and confining as the walls of any monastic library. You are served a version of the world that the algorithm has determined will keep you engaged, a river of knowledge whose flow is guided by commercial incentives rather than spiritual devotion. This new form of patronage is just as concentrated. A handful of powerful technology corporations now hold an influence reminiscent of medieval kings and bishops, their platforms acting as the primary channels through which public conversation flows. The narratives that gain the most traction, the ideas that achieve viral reach, often do so because they align with the economic and operational priorities of these digital courts. The age-old question of who gets to speak and who is heard has been answered once again by those who control the means of distribution. Even the chained library has its modern counterpart in the ongoing struggle for digital access. The debate over net neutrality is fundamentally a debate about whether all information should flow freely, or whether certain data can be placed on a faster, more expensive tier, creating a two-tiered system of knowledge. This recreates the medieval reality where access to authoritative information was a privilege, not a universal right. Some will have the full, high-speed library, while others are left with a restricted, slower collection. Understanding the scribe's legacy is not an academic exercise. It is a crucial tool for navigating the 21st century. It teaches us to look behind the screen and ask who the new gatekeepers are, what their priorities might be, and whose voices are being systematically amplified or quietly set aside in our own digital scriptoriums. The journey of Aristotle's works is a map of intellectual power. His foundational texts on logic, ethics, and the natural world did not flow directly from ancient Greece into the libraries of medieval Europe. Instead, they traveled a long and complex route, passing through many cultures and countless scribble hands, each one leaving a subtle mark on the final product. After the decline of the Western Roman Empire, the vibrant intellectual world that could read Aristotle in the original Greek largely faded. Many of his most important texts simply vanished from the Latin-speaking world, their physical manuscripts lost to time, conflict, or simple neglect. For centuries, his voice was a distant echo in the West, but while Europe was fragmented, his legacy found a vibrant new home elsewhere. In the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking monks continued to copy and preserve his original works. More significantly, his ideas traveled east, where they were eagerly embraced by Islamic scholars. In the great centers of learning in Baghdad and Cordoba, teams of translators rendered his complex Greek into Arabic. This was not a passive act of preservation. Brilliant thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes did not just copy Aristotle. They engaged with him, wrestling with his ideas and writing extensive, sophisticated commentaries that expanded upon his logic and natural philosophy. To these scholars, Aristotle was not a relic, he was a living conversation partner, and their commentaries became inseparable from his original texts. This fusion of Aristotle and Islamic interpretation was the version of his work that would eventually make its way back to the West. The crossroads for this great transfer of knowledge were cities like Toledo in Spain, a place where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim cultures intersected. Here, a collaborative effort of translators, often working in teams, began the monumental task of translating the Arabic versions of Aristotle, now bundled with their Islamic commentaries, into Latin. This was the moment of reintroduction, but it was a controlled and filtered homecoming. The Aristotle that arrived in Paris and Oxford was not the pure Greek original. He was a figure already interpreted through an Islamic lens, his ideas framed by the very commentaries that accompanied him. Unsurprisingly, this new, powerful, and non-Christian philosophy sent shockwaves through the European intellectual establishment. Church authorities, concerned by propositions that seemed to challenge theological truths, moved to contain the influx. They banned the teaching of certain aspects of Aristotle's natural philosophy at the University of Paris, seeing his views on the eternity of the world or the nature of the soul as a direct challenge. Yet the genie could not be put back in the bottle. The solution was not destruction, but a new form of control, mastered by scholastic theologians like Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas undertook a breathtaking project of intellectual reconciliation, writing his own vast commentaries to carefully reinterpret Aristotle's works, bending them to align with Christian doctrine. He argued that reason and faith were not enemies, and that Aristotle's logic could be harnessed to build a stronger, more rational foundation for belief. This was the final, crucial filter. The scribes of the 13th century were not copying a neutral Aristotle. They were reproducing an Aristotle who had been first framed by Islamic scholars and then systematically Christianized by Aquinas. This twice-filtered version, approved and adapted, became the authorized Aristotle, the foundation of the university curriculum for the next 400 years. The entire saga shows that the most influential ideas are not always the purest, but the ones that pass most successfully through the gates of cultural approval, their rough edges smoothed away by the hands of those who control the pen. The Book of Kells is a fortress of vellum and ink, created in a time of relentless Viking raids and internal Irish conflict. Its very existence was a bold act of defiance. This was far more than a simple Bible. It was a deliberate proclamation, a visual argument for the spiritual and intellectual supremacy of the Irish monastic tradition. In an era when outside forces threatened the centers of learning, the monks who crafted this book responded not with weapons, but with an overwhelming display of artistic genius. Every impossibly complex knotwork pattern, every luminous color, and every hidden animal figure woven into its pages declared one thing: here, in this remote corner of the world, we are the guardians of divine knowledge. The sheer scale of its creation reveals a monumental communal effort. Scholars believe the work required the hands of at least 3 different master scribes and a team of incredibly skilled illuminators, laboring for decades. The economic reality behind this is staggering. The book required the skins of roughly 185 calves, a massive investment of livestock and land. The pigments for its brilliant blues and greens were imported from across continents, at a cost that only the most determined and well-supported community could bear. This was not a project born from idle piety. It was a strategic allocation of a monastery's entire wealth, all channeled into creating a single object of undeniable power. The book's journey after its initial creation further illustrates how knowledge is tethered to political currents. It was eventually moved from its original home on the island of Iona to the inland monastery at Kells, a relocation almost certainly driven by the need for greater safety from coastal attacks. Centuries later, it was transferred again, this time to Dublin, as part of a broader centralization of ecclesiastical authority under English rule. Each move was a form of control, a decision about where such a potent symbol of cultural identity should reside and who should act as its custodian. The Book of Kells, therefore, is not just a book to be read. It is a statement to be witnessed. It stands as a permanent reminder that in the hands of scribes, art could become a shield for a culture and a testament to its ambition, proving that the most enduring power often lies not in territory conquered, but in the beauty and authority of the stories we choose to preserve. Yet the parchment could also carry the sounds of the tavern and the open road. Tucked away in a monastic library in Bavaria, the Carmina Burana manuscript survives as a vibrant testament to a world of knowledge that flowed outside the Church's direct control. Compiled in the 13th century, this is no dry liturgical text. Its pages are filled with the restless energy of wandering scholars, the Goliards, who composed poems and songs that celebrated earthly pleasures, offered gentle satire, and reflected on the changing turns of fortune. Here, love songs stand beside drinking ballads, and playful moralizing dramas share space with thoughtful observations about the religious hierarchy that employed most scribes. The mere existence of this collection is profoundly revealing. It tells us that the scribes who carefully copied these secular and sometimes unconventional verses were responding to a different kind of demand. There was a clear audience, perhaps within the monastery walls themselves, that valued this worldly, literary, and musical creativity. A monk copying a drinking song was not necessarily abandoning his faith. He might have been preserving a piece of popular culture for its artistic merit, or even for its use in less formal gatherings. This suggests that the boundary between the sacred and the everyday was far more porous than we often assume. The monastic library was not always a sealed vault for purely theological ideas. It could also act as a cultural repository, a place where the voices of the road, the marketplace, and the university were granted the permanence of ink and vellum. The scribe, in this context, becomes a different kind of gatekeeper. He is not just a guardian of orthodoxy, but also a curator of the human experience in all its complexity. He makes a conscious choice to preserve a playful poem that comments on authority, or a lyrical ode to springtime that has nothing to do with scripture. This act of preservation grants legitimacy to these secular voices, ensuring they are not lost to time. The Carmina Burana reminds us that the control of knowledge was not a single, unified effort. Even within the highly structured world of medieval scriptoria, there were openings where a more spirited, more human, cultural stream could find a way to flow forward, saved by the very hands we might expect to hold it back. A life spent copying the words of others demands a particular state of mind. For the monastic scribe, the endless repetition was not a chore but a form of active prayer known as lectio divina. This practice transformed his workbench into an altar. With each letter he formed, he was not merely replicating text. He was slowly, deliberately internalizing the sacred words, allowing their spiritual meaning to seep into his own consciousness. The physical act of writing became a meditative rhythm, a way to quiet the self and open the soul to divine understanding. This spiritual framework provided the ultimate justification for the grueling discipline and the profound tedium of his task. It elevated his labor from a simple craft to a sacred calling, a direct contribution to the legacy of faith, both his own and that of the readers who would one day encounter his work. This powerful motivation was the psychological engine that powered the Scriptorium for centuries, turning isolation and physical hardship into a path toward grace. For the secular scribe, however, the inner landscape was different. His motivation was a complex blend of intellectual curiosity, professional pride, and simple economic necessity. He took satisfaction in a perfectly executed page, his script a testament to his skill and training. He engaged with the texts he copied, whether a new legal argument or a work of natural philosophy, his mind actively processing the ideas even as his hand moved. And he relied on the payment for his work to sustain his livelihood, making his craft a vital link in the economic chain of a growing literate society. To see these individuals as mere robotic copyists is to miss the entire human dimension of their story. They were conscious, often deeply thoughtful participants in the grand project of cultural memory. Every time a scribe chose to correct a mistake in his source, or hesitated over a difficult passage, or added a tiny gloss to clarify a meaning, he was exercising his own judgment. He was not a blank slate. He was a living filter, bearing the immense psychological weight of knowing that the words he set down would become the official record, the authority for future generations. This quiet burden, carried in the silence of the scriptorium and the bustling secular workshop, is the invisible ink on every page they left behind. The quiet scriptoria of the Middle Ages and the bustling digital forums of today are connected by a single, unbroken thread, the human drive to guide what others come to know. Across centuries, we have witnessed how scribes, through their daily acts of selection and their gentle refinements, became the quiet architects of our intellectual inheritance. They did not merely copy words, they built the very foundations of the world we understand, their hands shaping the river of knowledge long before it reached our shores. This legacy carries a profound lesson for our own moment. Information is never a pure, untouched stream. It is always filtered, first by the technology that carries it, then by the economics that fund its journey, and finally by the personal and political beliefs of those who guide its flow. The medieval scribe working by candlelight and the modern algorithm sorting content in a data center are both engaged in the same essential act, curation. They decide what is amplified and what is quieted, what is preserved for the future and what is allowed to fade from view. Understanding this deep history is not an escape into the past. It is a vital tool for navigating the present. It empowers us to become more thoughtful, more discerning consumers of the information that fills our daily lives. We learn to look behind the screen and ask who the new gatekeepers are and what priorities might guide their unseen hands. This journey from scroll to scripture ultimately calls on us to appreciate the enduring power held by the hand that writes, the system that copies, and the individual who chooses to share the words we all live by. Let that awareness inspire you to question the sources of your own knowledge and to recognize the profound responsibility each of us carries when we pass a story along.